So here is a description of our spiritual response system as human beings. This is the inner self. We all have a mind's eye. We have a heart that feels truth and its emotional response. We all have a seed of truth. So, the seed of truth feeds the mind's eye its knowledge. As we sit and speak with each other, our words are understood through truth's awareness. So that feeds our mind's eye with its knowledge as we hear it, or see it, or otherwise absorb it, that then has an emotional response to that knowledge. We feel the knowledge that truth feeds us. So inside truth is movement. We call it intuition, gut feeling, that kind of thing. So our movement feeds our mind's eye with its knowledge. We have an emotional response to that knowledge that then goes down back into the root of truth. That then, because we understand the truth better, and then we understand it spiritually through the emotional response, and then in reaction to that emotional response to truth knowledge, we sit in silence with that truth and consider it. And we consider that in forethought, forethinking of the human will, the mind's eye that sees the human will. So, this is truth, the emotional response. We have a logic that furthers the knowledge of truth. But there is a bridge to cross before truth and logic a bridge to cross before truth and logic can connect with each other, where logic then feeds our mind's eye and our human will with the greater knowledge that truth fed to us. Okay? And that bridge is intellect. So, when the human self, all of us, sits in silence with that truth and knowledge, its emotional response, and the self accepting that emotional response, can sit in silence with that information and intellectualize the bridge to get to the greater light and logic that will further truth's knowledge into a greater cognitive knowledge. We intellectualize truth and its emotional response. So when intellect furthers truth knowledge, not conclusive knowledge, but gives us ideas and awareness of what truth is trying to speak to us in silence, then connects with the logic. That then gives us the greater cognitive knowledge of what truth is trying to tell us. Where then, once the self understands in its mind, in its heart, and in its movement, the greater knowledge, the self can then, through emotional wisdom, connect emotional wisdom, empathy, human empathy, to that greater knowledge. Where then the self can act through truth, the greater cognitive knowledge, to then create an act of empathy from that knowledge. And once the self has decided to do that, then behaves through that knowledge. And the behavior projects the spirit from which the self is in consideration of its knowledge and from where it's coming. These are the elements of light inside every cell of the human being, beginning with the root of truth. We all have a seed and root of truth. From the seed grows the root. The root is what feeds our mind's eye for our human will to consider the truth of what we experience through that experience. This is the mother of this spiritual influence, is the mother of all of our knowledge, because it gives birth to our awareness for what truth is telling us. Truth is all around us. All we have to do is adapt to it. And this is how we do it in the spiritual element of light. The mother of all knowledge and spiritual influence inside ourselves, I call the sacred feminine element of the God Spirit inside the self, where it births new knowledge into the mind's eye. Logic is the masculine element of the God Spirit that God gave to each one of us to calculate the greater knowledge from truth. Intellect is the Christ Spirit influence, where this influence acts as the bridge so we can consider in forethought truth's knowledge and its emotional response. Emotional wisdom is the Sophia Spirit influence. She gives us the ability to empathize, so we can use empathy and that wisdom to calculate into truth knowledge and logic's knowledge. So we can then act through that knowledge, projecting then a spirit of truth and trust. Trust is the Holy Spirit. The dark elements of spiritual influence in the inner self are these: mind's eye, human heart, the seed, truth, its emotional response, intellect that wants to act as the bridge between truth and logic, and emotional wisdom. Here's the spiritual elements of light. As I just explained, that's what happens. Our mind's eye is fed with the truth. We evaluate truth in our hearts and then project the spirit. But the dark elements of an evil spirit dwelling inside the physical soul, so that the sacred feminine element of the God Spirit inside the self is truth and its emotional response. The dark feminine influence inside the self is fear. How do I say this? When we become afraid of the truth, it's because we become afraid of truth, our own truth awareness and its emotional response. Fear latches itself onto our movement of truth and projects its own image on top of the truth. It can't act without our knowing of truth. So once we know our truth, fear will jump on, project into the mind's eye what we're afraid of losing inside that truth that we become aware of. That then projects its own emotional response of fear into our hearts, darkening our hearts that way. That then goes back down into the root of truth, where the self, from that projection of knowing fear in our heart, from the truth, projects then into the mind's eye the fear of loss. The fear of loss, if the human will calculates with the fear of loss, gives birth, not to intellect, but to a lust, to remain safe from that fear that just keeps going, and projects into the mind's eye multiple fears of losses, instead of intellect's knowing and the possibilities of a greater truth in knowing the original truth. So if the human will is calculating its thought with the fear of loss in fantasy, because it hasn't happened yet, therefore remaining a fantasy, then it cuts itself off from this bridge, and then the first lust created from calculating thought with the fear of loss is the lust to remain safe from what we are afraid of. And when that happens, we shut ourselves down. We stop expressing the truth and emotional response. Intellect is no longer a bridge, but a bridge to achieve that knowledge which meets our emotional needs. Once once we calculate our thought with truth knowledge, accept the emotional response, and acknowledge it, how do I say that? And acknowledge it builds the heart with a spiritual fullness that meets the emotional needs of the soul. We feel contentment from that fullness. And our heart seems to fill with that sense of fullness. But when we're calculating the lust to remain safe from what we're afraid of, creates then other lusts to get those needs met, because we're not meeting our need through the recognition